The autumn sun, no longer warm, flooded the farmyard through the tall trees standing at its perimeter. The grass, cropped short by the cows and still damp from the recent rain, glistened with a wet sheen. The earth, saturated with water, squelched thickly and spread apart underfoot. The heavy branches of the apple trees bent low to the ground, dropping their fruit, bright, light green little apples, into the dark greenery, tied in a row along a long fence, for young heifers were grazing. From time to time, they raised their heads and, turning towards the house, let out long, drawn-out moos. In front of the stable, a motley flock of chickens bustled about, fussily scratching at the manure and calling to each other with anxious clucks. Two roosters tirelessly searched for worms for their hens, summoning them with a caring, persuasive clucking. The wooden gate creaked, and a man of about 40 appeared on the threshold, yet he was stooped and haggard like a man of 60. He walked slowly, with a wide gait, his feet shod in heavy, straw-stuffed wooden clogs. His disproportionately long arms hung limp at his sides, like whips. No sooner had he stepped into the yard than a yellow mutt on a chain, tied to a tall old pear tree next to a barrel that served as a kennel, perked up. It wagged its tail joyfully and burst into barks. The man barked back. "Quiet, Fino!" The dog instantly fell silent. A peasant woman came out of the house. Her large-boned, flat-chested figure was tightly encased in a worn woolen jacket. From beneath a short skirt that didn't reach her ankles, her legs were visible in blue stockings and the same kind of wooden clogs stuffed with straw. A faded bonnet covered her scanty, slicked-down hair. Her black, thin, plain face, with its sunken mouth, was fixed in a dull and sullen expression, so common in these parts. Her husband tossed out a question. "Well, how is he?" His wife replied, "The priest said the end is near. He might not last till morning." They entered the house together. Passing through the kitchen, they found themselves in a low, gloomy room, with a light barely filtered through a small window curtained with a scrap of calico. The ceiling, crisscrossed with thick beams blackened by time and soot, supported a meager attic floor, a favorite promenade for whole hordes of rats. The lumpy, earthen floor was glossy with dampness. In the corner, discernible in the semi-darkness, a bed stood out, white. Upon it, shrouded in gloom, an old man was fading away, the peasant woman's father. From her came a heavy, wheezing, gurgling breath, like the sound of a faulty pump. The husband and wife approached the deathbed and stared at the dying man with a submissive and utterly indifferent gaze. The son-in-law pronounced, "Well, that's it. He won't last." The peasant woman added, "He's been rasping like that since noon, without a stop." They fell silent. The old man lay with his eyes closed. His ashen, withered face resembled a carved wooden mask. His labored, irregular breathing struggled from his half-open mouth, and with every sigh, the sheet of unbleached linen rose on his sunken chest. After a long pause, the son-in-law spoke again. "Nothing to do but wait for him to go. Can't be helped. It's just the turnips I'm worried about. The weather's right. High time to start weeding tomorrow." His wife grew concerned. After a moment's thought, she remarked, "If he dies today, they won't bury him before Saturday. That means you'll have all of tomorrow for the turnips." The man pondered for a long time, weighing something in his mind, and finally declared, "That's true enough, but I'll have to notify everyone for the funeral tomorrow. It'll take me at least 6 hours to get around everyone from Tourville to Maintot." His wife, after another 2 minutes of silence, found a solution. Then start today. Do the Tourville side. You'll manage before dark. It's only just past 3. Tell him he's already passed. He won't last the evening anyway." The husband hesitated a little longer, weighing the pros and cons, and finally made up his mind. "All right, I'll go." He was about to leave, but suddenly turned back and said, hesitantly, "Since you're free, shake down some apples. We need to bake 4 dozen funeral cakes for the guests. We have to offer something. And for the firewood, take the brushwood from under the lean-to by the press. It's good and dry." Leaving the room, he went into the kitchen, opened the cupboard door, took out a 6-pound loaf of bread, carefully cut a slice, gathered all the crumbs from the table into his palm, and tipped them into his mouth, so nothing would go to waste. Then he scooped a little salted butter from an earthenware pot with the tip of his knife, spread it on the bread, and began to chew slowly and thoroughly. He crossed the yard again, checked the dog, which had started barking once more, stepped out onto the country road that ran past the farm, and strode off in the direction of Tourville. Left alone, the wife immediately set to work. She opened the chest of flour and began kneading the dough for the cakes. She kneaded for a long time, heaving the heavy mass from side to side, squeezing, flattening, and squeezing it again. Finally, having shaped a large yellowish-white ball, she set it aside on the edge of the table. Then she went to fetch the apples, and, so as not to beat the fruit down with a pole and damage the branches, she leaned a ladder against the apple tree. She picked the apples selectively, choosing only the ripest, and carefully piled them into the fold of her apron. Suddenly, someone called to her from the road, "Hey, Annie Chico." She turned around. It was their neighbor, Uncle Ozem Fave, the village mayor. He was riding out to the field on a cart loaded with manure, his bare feet dangling over the side. "What is it, Uncle Ozem?" she called out. "So, your father, is he still with us?" he inquired. She shouted back without restraint. "He's as good as gone. We're planning to bury him Saturday at 7 in the morning. Work won't wait. We must get on with the turnips." The neighbor nodded. "Understood. Well, take care," she replied with the same rustic politeness. "Thank you, and you too." And she went back to picking apples, immersing herself in her work. Upon returning to the house, her first action was to check on her father, expecting to find him breathless. But even from the doorway, she was met by the same monotonous, loud death rattle. Without approaching the bed, so as not to waste time, she immediately set about making the cakes. She wrapped each little apple in a thin layer of dough, carefully arranging the finished cakes in neat rows on the edge of the table. After making 48 of them, a dozen per row, she remembered it was time to think about supper. Hanging a pot of potatoes over the fire, she decided not to light the oven proper. She still had the whole of the next day for all the chores. Her husband returned around 5. The moment he crossed the threshold, he threw out the question, "Has he finished?" "Not yet." Still rasping, came the reply. They went over to the old man. He lay in the same position. His hoarse, measured breathing, like the ticking of a clock, had neither quickened nor slowed. It sounded without interruption, and only its timbre changed slightly, depending on whether the air was entering his chest or leaving it. The son-in-law looked at him intently and pronounced, "He'll pass, so we won't even notice. He'll go out like a candle." They returned to the kitchen and, without uttering another word, sat down to supper. After eating their soup and following it with bread and butter, they washed the dishes and looked in on the dying man once more. The wife took a small lamp with a smoking wick and held it up to the old man's face. If not for that stubborn breathing, one might have thought him already dead. Their own bed stood in another corner in an alcove. They lay down without a word, put out the light, closed their eyes, and soon their discordant snores, one deep, the other thinner, merged with the incessant rattle of the dying man. And in the loft, as if nothing were amiss, the rats scurried about. The husband woke at dawn. His father-in-law was still clinging to life. Chico shook his wife awake, alarmed by the old man's incredible tenacity. "Hear that, Femi? He still won't die. What are we to do?" He always consulted her. She replied, "He won't last the day, that's for certain. No need to fret. And the mayor, I reckon, will allow the burial tomorrow." Look, it was the same with Uncle Renard. His father died right at the height of sowing. Convinced by her ironclad logic, the husband set off for the field. The wife baked the cakes and then took care of all the other household tasks. By noon, the old man was still breathing. The hired hands, weeding the turnips, came in a group to look at the peculiar old man who simply refused to die. Each offered their opinion, after which they all headed back to the field together. By 6 o'clock, when everyone had returned from work, the old man was still showing signs of life. The son-in-law began to worry in earnest. "What do we do now, Femi? What do you think?" She herself was at a loss. They had to go to the mayor. He obliged them and permitted the burial for the next day. The doctor, whom they also visited, out of respect for Uncle Chico, agreed to antedate the death certificate. The couple returned home, somewhat reassured. They lay down and fell asleep, just as the night before, and their powerful snoring once again accompanied the old man's weakening breaths. When they woke the next morning, he was still alive. At this, they completely lost their composure. They stood at the head of the bed, looking at the old man with suspicion, as if he were playing a cruel trick on them, deliberately lingering to vex them, to annoy them. And what infuriated them most was that because of him, they were wasting so much precious time. The son-in-law asked, his voice strained, "Well, what do we do now?" She didn't know the answer either and merely threw up her hands. What a fine mess, really. Now it was impossible to stop the invited guests, who were due to arrive at any moment. They decided to wait for them and explain the situation honestly. The first guests began to arrive at 10 minutes to 7. The women, wrapped in black shawls, advanced with an appropriately sorrowful air. The men, feeling constrained in their uncomfortable woolen jackets, carried themselves more simply and, walking in pairs, discussed their everyday affairs. Uncle and Aunt Chico, bewildered and crestfallen, met them on the threshold, and as soon as the first group approached, simultaneously launched into their lamentations. They vied with each other to explain how it had all happened, painted their unenviable predicament, bustled about offering chairs, apologized, went out of their way to prove that anyone in their place would have done exactly the same. They talked incessantly, not letting anyone get a word in edgewise. Darting from one group of guests to another, they kept repeating, "We never imagined he'd last this long. You simply wouldn't believe it." The guests, quickly grasping that the ceremony was off, were completely perplexed. Their expectations thwarted, they didn't know what to do with themselves and sat down wherever they could find a spot. A few even made moves to leave, but Uncle Chico detained them. "We must still have a bite to eat. We've baked all these cakes. What are we to do with them now?" At these words, the guests' faces visibly brightened. A subdued murmur arose. The yard gradually filled with people. The first arrivals hastened to share the news with the latecomers. Everyone began whispering animatedly. Upon hearing the magic word cakes, the company's spirits were fully restored. The women took turns going into the house to look at the dying man. Stealing up to the bed, they crossed themselves fervently, muttered something prayer-like, and beat a retreat. The men, less keen on such sights, only stole glances through the now open window. Aunt Chico was right there with her commentary. Second day like this, neither here nor there, rasping like a pump with no water. Once the spectacle was exhausted, it was time for a snack. But the kitchen couldn't hold everyone at once, so the table was carried right out into the yard and set down in front of the door. 48 cakes, rosy and tantalizingly appetizing, lay on 2 large platters, drawing everyone's gaze. Each person hurried to reach for one, afraid they might not get their share. In the end, however, even 4 cakes were left over. Uncle Chico, chewing, spoke with his mouth full. If the old man could see us now, how upset he'd be. He loved these cakes so much in his time. A portly, jocular peasant immediately chimed in. Well, he won't be tasting any now. Everything in its turn. This remark didn't sadden the assembly in the least. On the contrary, it amused everyone. Now it was their turn to devour the cakes. Aunt Chico, lamenting the expense, kept running down to the cellar for more cider. The pitchers were emptied one after another. The general chatter grew louder, and even cheerful shouts were heard, like at a proper feast. Suddenly, the old neighbor woman, who had stayed by the dying man out of greedy curiosity and a vague fear of her own future, leaned out the window and shrieked piercingly, "He's gone! He's gone!" Everyone fell silent at once. The women jumped up from the table and ran into the house to see for themselves. The old man had indeed passed away. His death rattle had ceased. The men exchanged glances, lowering their eyes, feeling awkward. After all, the cakes hadn't even been finished. Quite a time he'd chosen, you had to admit. The Shirkas were no longer lamenting. It was all over, and they were finally calm. They just kept saying, "We knew it wouldn't be long. If only he died last night, there'd have been no fuss at all. Well, it's all behind us now. They'll bury him on Monday. That's all there is to it. And for that occasion, they'll bake more cakes." The guests began to disperse, animatedly discussing the event they had just witnessed, pleased with both the spectacle and the refreshments. And when the husband and wife were finally alone, the wife said, her brow furrowed with worry, "Now we have to bake 4 dozen cakes again. Couldn't he have just died last night?" Her husband, resigned to fate, replied, "Well, it's not an everyday occurrence.